Welcome to the Good Chemistry Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Geoffrey West. Geoffrey is a distinguished professor and the former president of the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. He is a theoretical physicist whose interests are in fundamental questions that cut across physics, biology, and the social sciences. He has done research on things ranging from metabolism and growth, aging and death, sleep, cancer, innovation, cities, companies, and the accelerating pace of life. He's been a speaker featured in all kinds of places. You can find his talks online, on YouTube and elsewhere. And he's the author of the book Scale, which we discussed in this episode. Scale is all about the fundamental scaling laws that underlie how organisms, cities, and companies scale up and down in various ways. How things like metabolism change as animals get bigger, how things like the pace of life and the pace of innovation change in cities as they get bigger, and how various aspects of business change as a company scales up. The conversation covers a lot of ground, but it is fascinating, and Geoffrey talks about some of the underlying principles that actually provide a unified understanding of scale across all these different domains of life. As always, if you like the content of this podcast, please consider liking the podcast, downloading it, subscribing on YouTube, or becoming a patron on Patreon. Patrons support the podcast and help keep it ad-free for as long as possible. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Geoffrey West. Geoffrey West, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Nick. Pleasure to be on your show, so to speak, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I was really excited that I was able to get a hold of you. You wrote a book called Scale a number of years ago, and I read it, I don't know, perhaps 3 years ago now, and I don't even remember how I found it. It was serendipitous, I think, and I'm glad I found it because it was so eye-opening and delightful to read. And I want to get into all the stuff in the book. I don't want to give away too much at the beginning, but it was one of those books where it almost, especially in the beginning, there was many seemingly ordinary, and you might even say mundane questions that everyone, at least crosses their mind, that they don't actually have answers to. Why do we grow? Why do we die? Why do elephants and whales live longer than mice and birds? All of these seemingly ordinary questions that actually have really deep and exciting answers, I think. And so I want to start off by talking about organisms and metabolism and size and all of the things you get into in the book. And I want to start by asking a question that was related to a story that's in that first part of the book to get us talking about metabolism and animal size. So the question is, if for some reason you had to give an elephant a dose of the drug LSD, how would you give it the proper dose?
Yes, good question, of course. And indeed, it is a story in the book, an anecdote in the book, a true story. And maybe I should tell the story first so that people know the context. But this was some work done, I think it was around the year 1960 when LSD was just beginning to sort of come to the consciousness of people in pharmaceuticals and in psychiatry and so on. And everybody knew it had this very strong effect on, mostly at that time, it was actually on cats, but also even a little bit on human beings. Some people at I forget where it was exactly, in UCLA, that's right, at UCLA, were very interested, had gotten interested in LSD as a therapeutic drug. And for various reasons, they decided that it would be interesting to see what effect it would have on a very large animal. And they hooked up with someone in the zoo in Oklahoma City. And they got permission to give an elephant whose name was Tusco a dose of LSD. And it brings up exactly the question you just asked: how much LSD do you give an elephant? So what was known at that time was, as I say, mostly about cats. And so what they did, which maybe is the most naive thing you would do, is simply take the weight of an elephant divided by the weight of the cat and multiplied by the dosage of a cat. That came out to be several hundred milligrams of LSD, and they injected into poor old Tusco, and within an hour, well, very quickly, he sort of went completely dysfunctional and trumpeting and all the rest, and within an hour died. And the conclusion of the experiment, so to speak, was that elephants have an anomalous reaction to LSD. And lest you think this was some hokey piece of work, the person that did the work, the original psychiatrist, was a very well-known psychiatrist, and it was published in the very distinguished scientific journal called Science. So it has great pedigree. If you think about it a bit, you realize that the extraordinary naivete which was used in coming to the amount that they injected Tusco. But more generally, of course, it does bring up the question of how do you scale up when you know something at one size to another size, and it permeates all of society. I mean, after all, the design of airplanes and ships or even automobiles often done first, some parts of it are done on scaled models, which you then scale up. And the fundamental question is that of how to scale up. But in particular, one that is even of relevance right now as we speak is many of the experiments done with drugs, new drugs, of course, are done on mice, sometimes on rats, but mostly mice. And the question is, how do you scale up? And maybe later we can even talk about this. When people are looking at cancer, almost all the research on cancer is done on mice. And the question then is, you've done something on mice, you observe something on mice, how do you scale it up in terms of understanding cancer and therapeutic interventions in human beings? So going back to Tusco and injection of LSD, how much LSD should you have given poor old Tusco? The first thing you realize is that when you give a drug, when we intake a drug, that drug, first of all, gets many drugs get distributed throughout the body if they're not localized, first of all, through our circulatory system. And most importantly, though, that when they have to cross surfaces, there's lots of membranes and surfaces, they cross surfaces, and as distinct from filling a volume. And so what you should really ask is not how does the weight of an elephant vary or what is its relationship to the weight of a cat, but rather sort of what the areas, in particular, even at the surface area of an elephant, how does that scale relative to that of a cat? And this is a well-known problem that goes back to Galileo. Galileo was the first to realize that there was this fundamental difference between how volumes scale versus how areas scale. And he realized not only that, he realized the extraordinary implications of it. And one of them, in fact, is this one, because just think of a cube of size 1 inch, 1 by 1 by 1. And of course, the 1 by 1 by 1. The volume of that is 1 cubic inch. Now double the size. It's 2 by 2 by 2. That's 8. So it's 8 cubic inches. But think of the area. Think of one face of it. The face of the one that's 1 by 1 is 1 square inch. But the face of the 2 by 2 is just 4. So whereas the volume has increased by a factor 8, the area has only increased by a factor of 4, half as much. And in general, it's clear that the volume increases like the cube of a typical length, say the height of an organism, of an animal, whereas surface areas increase by the square. Now, of course, if you have a huge difference in height, that's an enormous number. I mean, if you increase, in other words, so if something is 10 times longer or higher than something else, and you just scale it up, keeping the geometry basically the same, then the volume is increased by 10 by 10 by 10, which is 1,000. But the area, each area is only increased by 10 by 10, 100. So there's an enormous difference. And indeed, instead of having to use, if you do that calculation for elephants versus cats, instead of a few hundred milligrams, it's more like 2 or 3.
Yes.
And which is a perfectly reasonable dose. And so this is a fundamental error that was made by, extremely good researchers who obviously didn't appreciate this phenomenon. And of course, it is, by the way, in the pharmaceutical industry, when they develop drugs, what you pay for a drug, a huge amount has gone into the question of how does it scale up. And the simplest thing is to do what I just said. And one of the things I talk about in the book, by the way, was at the time when I learned about this story, I still had young babies, actually. And you have these little baby Tylenol bottles. And I looked at the back of the Tylenol bottle to see how they scaled up with weight. And the thing that shocked me was that, so they tell you, if it weighs 10 pounds, so much, half a tablet, 20 pounds, 30 pounds, and so on. And it just gives you the numbers. And it goes all the way up, I think at that time, anyway, it started with a baby, a newborn baby, basically, and went all the way up to like a 10 or 11-year-old. And it went up with their corresponding weights. And to my horror, it went up linearly, just as those researchers had done with Tusco the elephant. And you can calculate, and you will see that there's a huge difference, actually, between scaling up in this naive way versus scaling up in at least some semblance of paying attention to what is actually happening with that drug. Namely, it has to diffuse across surfaces, and so surface area plays a dominant role, and which would give very different dosages. And I asked various pharmaceutical people if people were aware of this, and of course they are, but somehow the company made Tylenol at that time didn't seem to be or didn't care. But I have noticed more recently, in fact, when I wrote the book, I went to the CVS and looked at the Tylenol bottles of baby Tylenol and found that they'd taken this off. This no longer was on there. So, but it's fundamental, and that little example by which you've introduced our conversation is actually fundamental across all of science and technology and social life. That asking those questions of how do we scale, whether we scale up a drug, whether we scale up any physiological quantity, whether we scale up aspects of life in a city, and so on. A company, how does a company scale from something small to something big? As I say, how do you scale up when you design machinery, and so on and so forth? So it's fundamental, and that's what this book was about.
Yeah, and one thing that comes through in the book is that the very natural interpretation is actually the wrong one. When something gets 10 times larger, you don't just increase everything by 10.
Yes.
And it was fascinating to see all of the examples therein. One of the things I want to talk about is metabolism. And so similar to the example with the elephant, I had a guest previously, and we were talking about experiments to do with the drug psilocybin, which is being used for therapeutic applications recently. And it was described to me that, if you give a human being a dose of psilocybin, it's going to have effects that persist for hours, on the scale of several hours. If you give a comparable dose, scaled, even appropriately scaled to a mouse, it has effects for minutes, tens of minutes. So the rate at which these drugs are metabolized is different. So can you describe for listeners, what is metabolism and how does metabolic rate vary as you scale up from a smaller to a bigger animal?
Sure. And indeed, it was the question about metabolism and its various implications that sort of got me into all the biological implications of this and sort of turned me into a kind of pseudo-biologist as part of my career. So metabolism, of course, just superficially, is the process by which one takes in food, whatever that may be, and turns it into something that can be used to dynamically move things, act on things, and so on. And so for us, what that is literally we take in food, we eat plants and animals and so forth, and then we have this extraordinary process that takes place within our cells that turns that into metabolic energy in the form of a chemical, a highly complex biochemical process producing a chemical that's called ATP, which is basically your currency of energy. There are these molecules, and there's a process, there's a biochemical process, which I don't think we should spend time on, that actually is a way in which you use that biochemistry, the cycling of that biochemistry, to provide energy to your cells, and then by the coherent behavior of cells, of course, provide energy to your body and do all the things that we do. And but integral to that process, so there's this fundamental level of biochemistry, but integral to that process, of course, okay, so you produce this molecule of ATP, this sort of currency, your dollars, so to speak, inside cells. And by the way, you produce them in little things called respiratory complexes, which sit inside little potato-looking so-called organelles called mitochondria, which I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of, and they sit inside the cell. And just to give you the scale of things, they're in most of your active organs, the cells contain 500 to 1,000 of mitochondria, and inside each mitochondrion, there are maybe 500 to 1,000 of these respiratory complexes. So each cell has up to 1 million of these little engines producing ATP. So it's sort of extraordinary, actually. But, so you produce it at this highly localized level, and then you have to distribute it, of course, throughout the body. Not only that, you have to supply it. I mean, you have to, the way you produce ATP is by a so-called oxidative process. That's why you have to breathe. You breathe in oxygen that supplies fuel for producing ATP. But of course, that's highly macroscopic. You breathe in through your mouth or nose, goes to your lungs that energy, that oxygen then gets transferred to your cardiovascular system, into your bloodstream, which then delivers it down at the microscopic level to the cell. So that's sort of the system. And so there are two parts. As I say, there's the fundamental biochemistry, and then there's these extraordinary networks, the one of which you're most familiar with being the two really the most familiar with are your cardiovascular system, which is delivering oxygen to the cells, and then there's your respiratory system, your lungs, which are taking oxygen out of the air and delivering it into the cardiovascular system. So, at first you might think, well, look, since it all happens inside cells, the actual production of your energy, if you double the size of an organism, you therefore double the size of your cells. You have twice as many cells. So you have twice as many of these little engines. So you would have twice the metabolic rate. That is, you would require twice as much food to feed an animal twice the size, because you have twice as many cells. That's not the case. It's the thing that is extraordinary is that if you double the size of a mammal, let's just say mammals for the moment, then instead of needing twice the amount of food, twice the amount of incoming energy, you only need, roughly speaking, 75% as much anytime you double. So if you go from 2 grams to 4 grams, you double. I'm sorry, you only need 75%. So you double the size, you only need 75%. But if you went from 2 kilograms to 4 kilograms, or from 200 kilograms to 400 kilograms, doesn't matter. You only need 75%. So each doubling only requires 75%, which means, in English, so to speak, that the bigger you are, the more efficient you are, because you need less energy to support the same mass of tissue. And the question then is, why is that? Where does that come from? And that comes from the constraints of the delivery system, of these transport systems that are taking blood to your cells and then delivering energy to your cells. So your circulatory system and so on. So, and we're all familiar with them. We know that they look sort of, if you look out the window and you look at a tree, it sort of looks like a tree inside you. It starts with you have your heart, you pump blood through your aorta, and then it goes through this multiple branching network delivering down to capillaries. Capillaries then transfer the oxygen to the cells. And the work that I got involved with was, in fact, trying to understand where this extraordinary economy of scale, this savings, every time you double the size, or just simply saying the bigger you are, the less energy you need per cell or per gram of tissue, was proposing that this theoretical idea that it is because of the constraints of the network. And so, without going into any details, it was that the various constraints of the network, such as something that seems so simple, that first of all, the network has to go everywhere. Every cell has to be fed. Another one was that as you change sizes among organisms, or as you grow from a baby to an adult, even though everything is getting bigger, you go from a mouse to a whale, or from a baby to an adult, even though everything's getting bigger, actually the size of your capillaries or the size of your cells do not change. They're the same. You look at a cell or a capillary of a whale, it looks just like yours and mine. And the point of that is that when natural selection evolved new species, it didn't reinvent the basic fundamental units. It built from the same fundamental units like capillaries and cells and so on, and genes. It used the same thing over and over again to make, horses and elephants and so on. And so that's another fundamental constraint on the network, that the terminal units are sort of fixed. And the last constraint on these kinds of networks is also coming from natural selection, and that is that the continuous feedback processes or mechanisms that are implicit in natural selection, the continuing honing of the system through survival of the fittest, leads to a kind of optimized situation. That is, that the circulatory system that we have, we meaning not just you and me, not just every human being that's on this planet, but every human being that's ever lived, not only every human being that's ever lived, every mammal that's ever lived. We all share the same cardiovascular system, and it is the one that has evolved to minimize the amount of energy our hearts have to do to pump blood through the system to supply oxygen to the cells. You want to minimize that in order to maximize the amount of energy left over to have sex, reproduce, and make children, and put forward your genes. So that's the idea. It's sort of to increase, in technical terms, to maximize fitness, you minimize the amount of energy you need in keeping organisms alive. And that means optimizing the network. And just to finish off that story, if you do that and you put all those words, which I said in English, into mathematics, which is non-trivial, but you can do it. If you put it into, and you grind the, the machine, so to speak, out comes these extraordinary scaling laws and this 75% savings. And indeed, the other thing that comes out of it is that any physiological quantity that we have, which we haven't talked about, or the other ones, one of which is indeed what you started out the question with, and that is that the time taken to metabolize a drug is much faster in a mouse than it is in a human being. We can calculate that. And again, it satisfies a very simple scaling law, which has built into it this kind of 25%, this 1/4 kind of quantity.
So there's a lot there.
Yes, there is a lot there, and I'm sorry I talked too much.
Let me repeat some of that to make sure I'm following, and then I have some follow-up questions that I think will make this even more clear to people. So you mentioned the concept of economies of scale, which many people have heard about in another context. You typically hear about that in the context of an economics course or a company becoming more efficient as it grows. And we are going to talk about companies at the end, but something similar seems to be true with animals. As the animal gets bigger and bigger, the animal is more metabolically efficient. And what you're saying is, if you double the size of an animal, if you increase it by 100%, you don't need 100% more food to power that animal. You only need a 75% increase. So there's this economy of scale. And ultimately, that very specific and quantifiably elegant way of describing that is due to the fact that all animals are made out of the same basic building blocks. Evolution is playing with the same basic building blocks in the form of our cells and what they do. And at the end of the day, animals are simply being optimized by natural selection forces so that they're putting as little effort and energy into running their bodies as possible, such that they can put as much energy as possible into reproduction. So your body wants, if I'm going to anthropomorphize, your body wants to spend as little effort as possible beating your heart and pumping your blood, and spend as much of that energy that you have from your food as possible on ultimately finding a mate.
Correct. So that's the idea. That's the conceptual framework. And as I said, and you've said it so much more articulately than I did, I thank you.
I've read the book a couple of times.
So yes, the only thing I would add to that is that also implies, in terms of the concept of economy of scale, is that that means that per gram or per cell, you need less energy. Therefore, your cells are working less hard than your dogs or your cats, but your horse's cells are working less hard than yours in a very systematic, predictable, quantitative fashion. And that has extraordinary implications, in terms of, lifespans and the amount of damage that is being done by metabolizing and so on, how long you sleep and so on. And we can discuss those if you wish, but it's fundamental to life, and it is in that sense that I mean economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less you need per either gram of tissue or per cell.
Yes, and I was about to ask about some of the things you just touched on. So as animals get bigger, their cells have to work less hard, basically. And how does this tie into things like lifespan? So bigger animals tend to live a long time. Little animals like mice tend to live for a very short period of time. How does that tie into this? And how does it tie into, seemingly everyday things like, why do little babies sleep for most of the day, but as we grow, we don't have to sleep as much? And why do we even grow at all and then stop growing?
all of the above come from this. So indeed, so let's first talk about aging and death, particularly mortality. But the fact that you're metabolizing, the fact that your cells are doing work, and the fact that that work is primarily being done in order to combat the wear and tear that is naturally occurring. So, for example, in this process of metabolism, you are generally dissipating energy, that is, making energy that is not useful, by two processes. One is, if we think of that network, your cardiovascular system, there's blood flowing in it. It's being pushed through your arteries and capillaries and so forth. And it's wearing you out, actually, very just like trucks driving on the highway, mm-hmm. or water flowing through the pipes in your house. They eventually actually do wear, and that's what's happening inside you. And of course, you are repairing yourself as well, and there's a trade-off, because repair is very expensive to continually repair. And so, but that eventually, that production of wear and tear, which is in physics is called entropy, the production of entropy, and has a much more profound origin in terms of the so-called second law of thermodynamics, which simply says that if you create order, if you spend your energy to create order, which is what we're trying to do when we eat to keep us whole and keep us healthy, you necessarily create disorder. Mm-hmm. That creation of disorder is called entropy. And so it's inevitable that you do create wear and tear. And that's why, we have problems with the environment. Maybe we can come back to that later when we talk about cities and so on. But in the context of our bodies, in terms of biology and life and death, we create disorder in the form of wear and tear, first of all in the networks, but also in the production of our fundamental energy in terms of this molecule ATP, because in so doing, there are sort of biochemical networks, and one of the products there is something that are called oxygen radicals, which many people have heard about. That's one of the products of the production of ATP. And those oxygen radicals, what all that means is that it's the difference between an oxygen radical and the oxygen we're breathing is that it's stripped of an electron. And that means it's charged, which means it attracts other things and can be highly destructive. And so, and we have mechanisms inside us to try to combat that. And of course, there's now been a whole industry created in terms of antioxidants and so on, partly, hopefully, to help combat that. But it is inevitably creating damage inside our cells. And as I say, we do repair ourselves. So, but the crucial point here is two things. One is there's this inextricable, continuous degradation of the system, which happens to us. And natural selection has evolved so that we repair enough of ourselves so that we live, if we were in our so-called natural state, till about 35 or 40. Mm-hmm. And in that time, we'll have had maybe 10 to 15 children, offspring, of which maybe half to two-thirds would have survived. And that was our natural state. And by the time we're 35 or 40, natural selection doesn't care. We've done our job, we produced our children, and then we would die. And mm-hmm. indeed, the natural lifespan of a human being, prior to about, 1900, very recently, worldwide, the expected lifespan of a human being was between 35 and 40. It's only in the last 150 years that it has changed. And we can come back to that later, because it's actually to do with cities and health and so on, healthcare and so forth. But So we have this degradation that's going on, and but we learned just a little while ago that we have this economy of scale, meaning we require less energy to support a cell in a larger animal than a smaller one. Therefore, there's less damage is being done in a larger animal rather than a smaller one. Therefore, a larger animal will live longer in a predictable way, in a way that you can actually calculate. And that's why large animals live much longer than small ones. A mouse lives maybe 2 to 3 years. A shrew, which is the smallest mammal, lives maybe 1 to 2. And a blue whale lives for about 125 years. And so, their rate of aging is extremely slow. And so this economy of scale and this hegemony, if you like, of the network controlling the distribution of energy has extraordinary implications for not just our physiology, but our whole life history from birth until death. And going back to the second part of your question, namely concerning babies to adults, it's a similar thing. We do much more damage potentially when we're smaller than when we're larger. And in fact, maybe I should talk about sleep a little bit, because it's closely related to aging, surprisingly. I mean, at first we don't think in those terms, but aging and sleep are very closely connected, because the reason we sleep is that we are, as I say, continually damaging ourselves, so to speak, and thereby aging. But we're also repairing ourselves. As I'm sitting here, my body is not just creating damage, but it's repairing my liver, my pancreas, and so forth. But it's very hard for it to repair my brain, because I'm also trying to be articulate and think and have a conversation with you at the same time. Very hard if I spend a lot of my time and energy trying to fix all those little damages that are being done in my neurons.
It's like an auto mechanic, right? Your auto mechanic's going to turn off your car and park it in the garage before it fixes the engine.
Exactly. You do not repair your car while driving. You stop it. You either get out and repair it yourself, or you have a dedicated time. You take it to a garage and give it to a mechanic who has a dedicated time repairing it. The same with something like the internet. When they want to do something to the internet, repair something, or your local server or whatever, they try to do it at night or on weekends when there's less activity. And so it is with our brains that we have to have a dedicated time, because we need to be active, we need to be in control. And so we need to shut the system down in order to do that. And here's really the other crucial part about the brain, and that is we need to repair it faithfully, meaning that, it doesn't really matter very much if you don't get things exactly right repairing your pancreas or your liver. And in fact, it does age, of course, but it can last 100 years. And if it's a little bit different at my age than it was at your age, okay, I'm not as healthy as you, but, I'm still functioning. But if I don't do that to my brain, if I don't make sure that it's very carefully and in a detailed way repaired, very soon I will not be me. I will start to become dysfunctional. I will start to have all kinds of serious psychological and mental issues, and I will no doubt become demented, and in fact will die. Let me just tell your listeners, if they're not familiar with it, it's quite extraordinary that this was first done right at the turn of the 18th to 19th century, about 1900, by a Russian biologist named Manassian, who did the following. she took a bunch of puppies, and it's kind of a horrible experiment in a way, and would not let them sleep. They were simply never allowed to sleep. And within less than a week or two, they all died. She took another bunch of puppies and starved them for over 20 days, nearly a month. And they lived. And once she gave them food, they came back to being normal. And so the brain, requires detailed repair mechanisms, which is what we have. So we spend, even though the brain is only 2% of our weight, 2% of our tissue is brain. It takes 20% of the food you eat goes to support your brain, and almost all of that goes to keeping it in this faithfully repaired state.
So the reason that we're mortal and that we're finite and we die is because, as a natural consequence of being alive and having metabolism, we're accumulating wear and tear that will eventually kill us.
Yes.
And the reason that sleep is so important is because it's fixing the wear and tear that's accumulating. And the reason that bigger animals need to sleep less and smaller animals sleep more, human babies sleep more than adults, mice sleep 20 plus hours a day, it's because they're chugging along so quickly in a metabolic sense that they accumulate damage faster, and they actually need to dedicate more time to fixing the damage.
Exactly. And that was the punchline of what I was saying. Exactly.
Interesting.
Another one of those, it's kind of a secondary implication of this extraordinary systematic economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less energy is needed to support a cell. And therefore less damage. And just as you said, therefore less sleep. And it's kind of amazing. Most people don't know that an elephant only sleeps 3 or 4 hours a night. Whereas a mouse sleeps 16 or so. And a blue whale, by the way, only sleeps probably about 2 hours, if that. And as you well know, as you already said, a baby sleeps 16 to 18 hours a night when it's newborn. So once upon a time, we slept much longer than we did now, in our own individual lives. But we settled down at 8, and that's what we need to keep this, our brain functioning. And we all know the symptoms if you have a lousy night's sleep, and if you, especially when you're a student or you have some huge project you've got to get done, and you only get, 5 or 6 hours a night. After a week of that, you're in pretty bad shape.
So one of the last questions I want to ask about organisms before we move on to cities is, and I don't want to get too deep into the math here, but, and for those that don't know, Geoffrey is a physicist in terms of his background. So there's a lot of math in the book that's fascinating. But what's sort of funny is a lot of people have heard of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the famous scene in that book where someone says the answer to life is 42.
Yes.
When you read Geoffrey's book Scale, you might say that the answer to life is the number 4. So where does this number 4 come up? We've sort of touched on it very briefly so far, but where does 4 come from? And how does that tie to concepts from fractal geometry?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so I already remarked, and we've discussed the scaling of metabolic rate. It's the most fundamental because it's, energy is fundamental. And that has this sort of 25% savings with each doubling. So there's the number 4, 1/4, 25%. But what is extraordinary, and what I didn't say then, is that if you look at any physiological quantity that you can measure, something as mundane as the length of your aorta, and so on, and something as sophisticated as lifespan, or so anything to do with your physiology or life history that can be measured, then it scales with somehow dominated by this number 1/4. So things like your growth rate also increases in the same way as your metabolic rate, not surprisingly maybe, but again with a 75% savings with each doubling and so forth. So there's all these multiple quantities, all when you look at how they scale are dominated by this number 1/4, this number 4. And indeed, where does it come from? Well, it does come from these properties that I try to articulate about the multiple networks that sustain our lives. The one we've concentrated on is the circulatory system, but it's true of all our multiple networks that transport energy and information, that they all have these kinds of properties, that they have to go everywhere, they have to be space filling, they have their terminal units that are invariant, don't change with size, and there's this kind of optimization. And out of that comes this number 4 from mathematics, but that number 4 has an interesting interpretation that comes also from the mathematics. The mathematics also says that the optimal configuration of these networks is that they're fractal-like. That is, it's like a tree. If you cut out any piece of a tree, it looks like a little tree. And then if you take another piece of that, it looks like an even smaller tree. And that's true of the vast majority of the networks inside us. And that fractal behavior is a reflection of the, so to speak, optimization that we're striving towards. And that number 4 gets reflected, or is a reflection of two things, actually. One is this fractal nature, but the other is that the number 4 is really actually, from the mathematics, 3 plus 1, which sounds a bit Zen-like, but the 3 is the dimensionality of space in which we live. You said it's space filling, it has to go everywhere. That means it's sensitive to the dimensions of space that it has to fill, and that's the 3 dimensions of space we live in, so to speak, up, down, and sideways. And and the plus 1 comes from this fractality. Fractals endow objects geometrically in terms of the way they scale with something that can be interpreted as an extra dimension. Mm-hmm. And so, very roughly speaking, the 4 is actually the dimension of space we fill plus 1, which means that if we lived in, 11 dimensions, which my string theory friends think maybe we do, instead of everything being dominated by 1/4, they'd be dominated by 1/12.
1/12, 11 plus 1. The way that,
and indeed,
those listening, go ahead.
No, I would just add one thing. It may have occurred already to listeners. Look, if we lived in 2 dimensions, if you lived in sort of flat space, everything we do dominated by 1/3 instead of 1/4. So we've actually tried to do some little experiments on looking at plants that grow, like ivy, dimensionally, and we had a student do this some years ago, and indeed what we learned was that the data on the stuff that he measured was consistent with the 1/3, but unfortunately you couldn't grow ivy big enough to have big enough change of scale to really test it rigorously. So but it was consistent with 1/3. It was just
interesting.
So it was interesting, we've often thought about looking at flatfish and things like that. But again, there isn't the data out there. There isn't enough sort of range of sizes to really test it.
Mm-hmm. So we're 3-dimensional creatures, spatially speaking. Everyone understands that intuitively. You can go forward, back, up, down, left, right. And then when you start talking about the fractal geometry stuff, everything gets a plus 1. So we're, in some sense...
Yes, if it's fully fractal, if what's called completely fractal, then it adds 1.
Mm-hmm. And the way...
Most fractals are only partially.
I see. The way that I tried to wrap my head around this when I first read it was, I imagined like a string of yarn. and we could just call that one dimensional. And then
Yes.
maybe you just bend the string in an S shape on itself so that it's rectangular. You could imagine taking a string of yarn, bending it so that it's a flat rectangle, and now it's a one-dimensional string, but it's behaving as if it's a two-dimensional sheet.
That's
Is
right.
that the intuition?
Yes, it's sort of like that. And in the book, I tried to give the example of bed sheets, which are two-dimensional. It's a sheet, it's two-dimensional. But, when you scrunch it up, when you put it inside the washing machine, it becomes three-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a ball. You can scrunch it all up into a ball, and it acts three-dimensionally. And in fact, by the way, if you look at all the creases, all those multiple creases, some of which may be, quite large, maybe an inch or a couple of inches, some are tiny, a tenth of an inch and so forth. But people have actually looked at that. And if you look at the distribution of all those creases, they follow a fractal law. So it is a fractal, actually, a scrunched up sheet, if you look at all the multiple creases. And it is acting as if it's a three-dimensional object, even though it's a sheet, which is a two-dimensional object.
Interesting. So at the end of the day, all of these scaling laws are about network architecture.
Right.
And they dictate why we're mortal and finite, why we grow the way we grow, and so forth. But organisms are quite different from cities in some ways. And so I thought we could start talking about cities now. And in the book, at least at one point, you distinguish between two aspects of cities. One being their physical infrastructure, the roads and the power grids and those things. And the second being the socioeconomic factors that are enabled by this infrastructure.
Right.
And so can you talk about each of those and how they're similar or different to what we've been talking about in organisms?
Sure, yes. Just to elaborate on what just how you introduced it, when you say the word city to someone, of course, they immediately think of the city in terms of its physical infrastructure. That is, the buildings and roads and even maybe the telephone wires and all the rest of it. But it's very much the image of the city, the skyscrapers of New York or the boulevards of Paris, very much the image of a city. And of course, that is a city. But, it's in a certain sense, it's the less interesting part of the city because it's actually just the stage or the backdrop for facilitating social interaction. That's why we developed it. That's why we evolved it. And I would even argue that it is the most marvelous, wonderful machine we've ever invented because it is the facilitator of social interactions. It's a place, a successful city is, in terms of its infrastructure, is a place that encourages social interaction. It has lecture halls and stadiums and universities and schools and but places to bring people together. Businesses can be thought of that way. Places to bring people together to create ideas, to innovate, to create wealth, and so forth. And a great city not only has that, but it has informal places, lots of squares and coffee places and parks, again, to bring people together to create wealth, ideas, increase standards of quality of life. And that's what it's done. It's been unbelievably successful at doing it. So it's useful in that context to think of the city as these two components, its physicality, its infrastructure, which you could think of as associated with metabolism in terms of biology, because and the way I was talking about metabolism in biology was very much dominated by the transport of metabolic energy through networks. And that's what a city does. It's the roads, of course, and the transport system in general, and the electrical lines and the water lines and so on. And so in that sense, if we just focus on that for the moment, the city is quite biological and it's quite analogous to an organism. And so if you also think that as cities have evolved, and they haven't been evolved for very long. After all, they've only been around at most for a few thousand years, and the vast majority for a few hundred years. But nevertheless, they have evolved by some process akin to, natural selection, evolution. There has been some version of that taking place. And in that sense, there's also been a process towards some kind of optimization that's going on. That is, the various structures and the various transport systems and so forth have evolved towards that. Now, so if you take that and you go back to the ideas that we were talking about in terms of organisms and networks and metabolism, we would have a similar process here, that the kind of the metabolism of a city in terms of its physicality, in terms of the physical aspect of it, would be like an organism. It would have an economy of scale. That is, if you looked at various quantities, they would scale. And I didn't use this phrase sublinearly, meaning going back to the organisms, that 3/4, that 75% is less than 1, and we call that sublinear. And cities would also be sublinear. That is, if you doubled the size of a city, instead of needing twice as many roads and twice as many gas stations and twice as much length of electrical lines, you'd only need some percentage of those. And indeed, wonderfully, if you look at the data across the globe, urban systems across the globe, that's what happens. There is this extraordinary systematic economy of scale that if you double the size of a city, you don't need twice as many roads and twice as many gas stations and twice as the length of electrical lines. You only need not 75% as in biology, but 85%. So the only difference is that the amount that you save as you get bigger is a little bit less than it is for organisms. And by the way, we don't really understand why that is so. Why it is somehow related to the two-dimensionality of a city rather than three-dimensionality. But we don't fully understand. That part is still a work in progress. But we looked at data across the globe for all the physical infrastructure, and amazingly, what was fantastic, it had this same kind of universality. Namely, just as this, and I didn't really emphasize this, that scaling of metabolic rate and all the other physiological quantities, I talk mostly about mammals, but it's true of all taxonomic groups, birds, fish, insects, crustacea. And so it is for cities, that the scaling that we see, for example, in the United States is the same as we see in Argentina, as we see in Brazil, as we see in China, as we see in Japan, as we see in Spain. So there's this kind of universality that is at work, which is sort of extraordinary because, when you think of a city, especially somehow, you think of all the politics and the urban planning and all the development that goes on and the highly individual nature of a city and so forth. And yet, when all is said and done in this very coarse-grained way, everybody's sort of lined up according to this very simple law, these very simple laws. And so just as it is that, and I didn't put it this way, but in biology, even though the whale lives in the ocean and the elephant has a trunk and the giraffe has a long neck and we walk on 2 feet and the mouse scurries around and we all live in different environments, we're actually at the kind of 80-90% level scaled versions of one another following these nonlinear scaling laws. So it is in the United States that despite the fact that New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Santa Fe, where I live, all have different histories, have different geographies, even different cultures. Nevertheless, they are scaled versions of one another, at least as we've talked so far about the infrastructure. Amazingly, Santa Fe is actually a scaled-down version of New York, although it looks completely different.
Yeah.
And so on. So that's sort of amazing.
So another way of saying that that's kind of interesting is, so what you've just told us essentially is that if I go and count all of the gas stations in Santa Fe and I get a number that tells me the per capita concentration of gas stations in Santa Fe, I can predict with high precision the per capita density of gas stations in New York City.
Right, yes, at the 80-90% level. Now, by the way, I should add, we chose gas stations, but in the last 10, 20 years, things have changed about gas stations and so on. So there's caveats to this, of course, because there are social changes and innovations that come in, and we can talk about that in maybe a little bit. But so there's the infrastructure. But, as I said a little while ago, in a certain sense, that's the uninteresting part. And it's sort of, it is biological, but it's not the part that is the essential feature of a city, which is socioeconomic activity, meaning something to do with the way people interact with each other and the things that are outside of biology. And so we looked at socioeconomic metrics like wages, like crime, like the number of AIDS cases, number of flu cases, number of patents produced, that is the kind of innovation of a city and so on. And we looked at those as a function of city size. And here we found something different. We did find scaling. We found very good evidence of scaling, that it's quite regular and systematic. But instead of an economy of scale, meaning the bigger you are, the less per capita, in biology, the less per cell, now we found the bigger you are, the more per capita. The higher the wages per capita, the more AIDS cases per capita, the more fancy restaurants per capita, the more patents per capita. But what was fascinating was all of those to the same degree. Not only all of those to the same degree, but it was the same across the globe, roughly speaking. That is, and what the law was that if you double the size of a city, you don't get just twice as many patents produced, but you get twice as many plus 15%. Or you get, if you ask, there's violent crime, you get twice as much violent crime, double the size of a city. No, you get twice as many plus 15%. So this was true of all socioeconomic activity, whether it was good, like wages and patents and education, or whether it was bad and ugly, like disease or crime. And indeed, like the pandemic. We've looked at, of course, data in the pandemic. It's quite similar. So it's quite fascinating. So there was this extraordinary regularity, not just that cities scale within an urban system, so that Los Angeles is in fact a scaled down New York, I mean at the sort of 85% level, but that it's true across the globe. It's not that, you have to be a little bit careful here, it's within urban systems. That is scaling across China or Japan is the same as it is across the United States, but it doesn't say New York is a scaled down version of Beijing.
I see.
That is, it is if you renormalize. So New York is a scaled up San Francisco in the same way that Tokyo would be a scaled up Osaka within Japan, for example. Nevertheless, so they scale in the same way together, and what distinguishes Tokyo from New York is basically the overall scale of things, which is to do, of course, with the difference between Japanese culture and United States culture. So violent crime or murders will scale the same way between Tokyo and Osaka as it does between, say, New York and San Francisco. But the overall scale would be different because Japan is a much less violent society than the United States. And that, of course, is outside of this framework.
Mm-hmm. There is, this brings me to an interesting area, which is the nature of social networks.
Yes.
There's a great quote in the book where you say, cities are collective phenomena whose origins emerge from the underlying dynamics and organization of how people interact with one another in social networks. And so I wanted to ask you about the evolving nature of social interaction, and in particular, social media. So social media is drastically changing the way that social networks actually look and how we're able to communicate with people within our own cities and elsewhere around the globe. So how do you see social media changing the growth dynamics that we talk about for cities?
Sure. Let me answer. Let me first back off a little bit and first go to the first part of what you said. And that is because the first part is really answering where in the hell do these scaling laws come from in cities? It's pretty clear that as far as the infrastructure of cities, I already said it's to do with the network, the infrastructural networks. They're much like the biological networks, our circulatory system, respiratory system, and so forth. But what about these socioeconomic ones? Well, they're derived from social networks. The thing and the reason that cities are sort of scale versions of one another socioeconomically, and that it's the same across the globe, is that social networks are pretty much the same, not just across the United States, because we're all Americans, so to speak, but across the globe, because we're all human beings and we all have pretty much the same kind of social DNA, modulated, of course, by our culture, our local culture, and geography and history and so on. But the dominant thing, of course, is already sort of encoded, so to speak, in our genes and our neural networks. So that's why the scaling of the number of patents produced as a function of city size is related to the number of AIDS cases, because in the end, they all have their origin in the interaction between people. Okay, in much the same way, by the way, to bring it to something more current, that the reason we have pandemics is we interact and we exchange, unfortunately, viruses between each other. But, and that's what cities do best. That's why it's much, much worse in cities. That's what cities are there for, is for you to transfer, quote, viruses. But of course, they're supposed to be good viruses like ideas and money and so on. So it's quite similar. The dynamic is actually quite similar. And so in combating a disease like a pandemic, especially, you have to decrease social interactions, which is completely against the whole functionality of city, and of course means that you suffer socioeconomically for other things. But it's also why, and it's sort of obvious, why, flus and colds went way down this year, because we're all physically separating. Okay, so, and that is the underlying mathematical theory for how all this works. But that brings up exactly the question which you've asked, which is, okay, with the coming of the internet and the coming of IT in general, we've expanded, the so to speak, the reach, at least, and the immediacy of social networks. And how does that change things? And I must say, when I first started thinking about this, I thought, well, that's going to have a very profound effect. And it may well have a profound effect on these scaling, on the things. Of course, it has a profound effect in terms of, we just saw it in the last 4 years, and in terms of the election and so forth, as an example. But what effect does it have on these very general laws and kind of universalities? Does it change them? Does it change the 15%? And so on and so forth, and all the various implications of that 15%, which we haven't yet touched on. I first thought, yes, it's going to have, it's going to have a huge effect. But the more I thought about it and the more I read about previous major innovations, the less I was convinced. Because I began to realize that, a much bigger impact on human socioeconomic activity occurred much earlier. Occurred, of course, with first of all, the invention of the steam engine and the coming of trains and locomotives, because what that did was change people's spatial reach. Until the coming of the train, and even actually until relatively recently, the vast majority of people on the planet didn't move more than about 20 miles in their entire lifetime. They stayed highly localized because they were limited by walking, and if they were fortunate, being able to use a horse. And most people were limited by walking. And so they were highly limited in their spatial extent. And then comes along the locomotive, which opens it up. And of course, we wouldn't have America if it wasn't for the locomotive. I mean, that's what allowed people, even people that were very modest means, to move very large distances compared to what they could before. So that is an extraordinary change, an extraordinary discontinuity in human history. But, not so long after the coming of the locomotive, within, 50 years or so of its big impact, we had another equally and maybe even more so change, was the invention of the telephone. I mean, up to the telephone, messages and communication between people, unless you were in their proximity, would take at least days, and sometimes weeks, and occasionally months. You had to go overseas and so on. And, suddenly you could have instant communication. So we've had instant communication for well over 100 years through the telephone. And in fact, in some ways, more intimate instant communication that we've had now, because we actually talk to one another. Now, of course, we don't even talk to one another. We do. Before the most recent innovations of Zoom and so on, it was basically, messages. Text and emails and so on, which have a certain impersonal quality to them, whereas the telephone, at least, was still personal and still involved a much closer interaction. So what did that do? Well, as far as we can tell, it didn't change these scaling laws. And by the way, let me just make a tangential comment here, because that's an interesting question. It's been very hard to test them historically because we don't have data. But some of my colleagues did a wonderful test. They had data, archaeological data, which is a bit, I don't know. I mean, archaeological data it comes from things like pot shards and measurements of.
It's very coarse.
It's very coarse, of course. Nevertheless, there is a science of it. And they took this data of pre-Columbian urban system in Mexico, and which contains about 50 communities, turns out. And they looked at all these various archaeological metrics. And what did they find? That socioeconomic things scaled with this 15% addition, which was very nice, actually. It's a bit controversial, obviously, because of the very coarse nature of this data, but it was satisfying that at least it was consistent with that. But in general, it's been hard to test. But the tests that we've done, the data that has been done, shows that it hasn't changed. So what did it do? It sped up life, and this is something we did not talk about in biology. And I'd like to spend a minute or two just saying words. In biology, it was implied in what I said that those network effects and those scaling laws have also implied in them, as a consequence, is that the bigger you are, the slower everything is in a systematic way. And we touched on it because of your opening question about how long how long it takes to dissipate drugs in your body. It happens very quickly in mice and very slowly in elephants, say, or in us, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. And that's because things slow down in a systematic, predictable way. And that's associated with that economy of scale driven by the networks. Now move to cities where we have the opposite of economy of scale, increasing returns to scale, this superlinear scaling, as we call it. And I didn't say this, but concomitantly with that, we have, instead of the slowing of the pace of life, the increasing pace of life. And this is crucial, that network phenomenon increases the pace of life. And it's easy to understand because where does it come from? It comes from when we gather together, what cities do, bringing people together. A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks to D, and we build up on each other. We build up conversations, ideas develop, most of which are useless and irrelevant to most other people. They don't go very far, but they are building on ideas. Mm-hmm. And what is remarkable about cities and the whole phenomenon of this positive feedback in social networks is every once in a while it produces the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics or an Amazon or a Google. Mm-hmm. That's what it's done. And so that positive feedback is the origin of the superlinear. The bigger you are, the more you have per capita. That's why big cities get more, because they increase social interaction. And at the same time, instead of slowing the pace of life, they increase the pace of life in a systematic, predictable way. So diseases spread faster, ideas spread faster, and so on.
So I want to start to talk about companies, because you brought up a few that I specifically want to ask about. So far, a very high-level summary for me is animals follow these sublinear scaling laws, which makes us finite. It makes us mortal. We grow, we stop growth, and then we die. Cities exhibit some of these superlinear scaling laws, and this gives them the potential for unbounded growth and effectively immortality.
Exactly. So that's the idea. I didn't go through that, but that's exactly what the implications of this are. That sublinear scaling, economies of scale, lead to bounded growth, which is what we have. It explains, in fact, without going into any of the details, why it is that you grow quickly and then you stop and you spend most of your life in a roughly stable configuration. And of course, and you immediately realize that that's very bad in terms of our socioeconomic paradigm. I mean, since the discovery of fossil fuels, the exploitation of fossil fuels, and the Industrial Revolution, and the discovery of capitalism, entrepreneurship, and so on, the paradigm is one of open-ended growth. And what is very nice about this theory is that the positive feedback in social networks induces this superlinear behavior. The bigger you are, the more you have per capita. And if you feed that into what that says about growth, it says instead of bounded growth, you have open-ended growth, which is what we have. So it's very self-consistent and it's very predictive. It does have built into it a fatal consequence, a potentially fatal consequence, and that is that you cannot sustain that open-ended growth indefinitely, unless, and this is what the theory says, unless you innovate, unless you so to speak, start the clock over again by reinventing yourself, because otherwise the theory tells you would collapse in some finite time. And it goes by the name technically of a finite time singularity. In the mathematics, there's something called a finite time singularity, which says that the system will collapse in some finite time unless you, so to speak, reset the clock. You make a paradigm shift. You discover oil. You discover coal. You invent computers. You invent the IT. All these sort of are major paradigm shift that sort of, so to speak, resets the clock and allows you to continue with open-ended growth.
Mm-hmm.
And the price you pay for that, going back to how you started this conversation, the price you pay for that is that you have to do everything faster and faster.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where the rub is that can you, in fact, continue that increasing acceleration of the pace of life?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. We could probably spend an entire podcast on.
And that sort of leads into all kinds of speculative phenomena beyond what we've discussed. All I've said up to now pretty much is, has a very sound scientific basis and is confirmed by data and so on and so forth. Once we get into this area of what do we do about open-ended growth and collapse, it becomes much more speculative.
Mm-hmm.
But so it is related to the company stuff.
Yes. So now let's shift the companies. So in some sense, you could say that companies are more like organisms than cities in that they are mortal. They are born, they grow, they stop growing, and then they die. Yes. And so why is that? And what is perhaps the analog of metabolism in a company?
Yes. So these are tough questions, actually. These are, to tell you the truth, and part of the reason they're tough is unlike cities and organisms, we can't get data. We can get some data, and we get data. In fact, the data that we have is based on basically on tax returns, and that's potentially public, although we have to pay a minor fortune to get hold of that data, by the way. But we have that data, and that data, just so that everything I'm going to talk about is based on that data set, and that data covers all U.S. publicly traded company since about 1950.
Mm-hmm.
So everything I say is based on that. We don't have private companies, and we don't have data before that. So there's, but what we also need. So one of the things that is very important for understanding organisms in particular, but also cities, is we know an enormous amount about our physiology. We know what we know what we look like on our insides, both macroscopically in terms of the all these networks and our organs and so on, but also within ourselves. We know in great detail what goes on in our cells, about our genes and so on. What do we know about companies? Despite all of the business schools, case studies and so on, not a lot, actually, in terms of the kinds of things we need to know. What are the networks inside companies? Who's talking to who? Mm-hmm. How does it really work? Who is that? It's proprietary.
Right.
And it's very hard to get. As I say, there are case studies, but there isn't the kind of systematic study of the number of companies, by the way, in that data set is about 30,000. What you'd like to have is all the details of what goes on inside those 30,000 companies, many of which no longer exist. Mm-hmm. That's what you'd like to have. And of course, we don't. So there's big caveats. And that's what makes answering your questions a little bit more difficult. Nevertheless, we can ask the first question that starts off all of these studies, and that is, do companies scale?
Mm-hmm.
Is Walmart or Google a scaled-up version of some small company that is in your town? And roughly speaking, the answer is yes. If you look at the various metrics that we have, what do we have? We have sales, we have income, we have expenses, we have number of employees, we have their assets. So we have all these various things that you can imagine need to be reported to the IRS, and they get sifted through data sets that we buy from Dun & Bradstreet, for anyone interested. It's called CompuStat. And we use that data set mostly to examine this. We do have, by the way, I should mention, we have a Chinese collaborator in Beijing who had access to similar data for the Beijing and Shanghai stock markets. And one of the remarkable things is that data, even though it was only, the stock market's only been going 10 or 15 years, mimics the US stock market in terms of the scaling results. That's just a side comment. So that was kind of nice. But so the data does show good evidence of scaling, but there's much more variance. There's much more spread and noise in the data, as you might expect, because many of these companies were only 10 years old. And part of the conceptual framework behind scaling is that it often represents, as I mentioned, talking about biology, something that's being optimized in the system. And, life has been around a very long time. And so, all these feedback mechanisms in natural selection have led to very good scaling. And if you look at those graphs, they line up beautifully. If you look at cities, well, they've only been around hundreds of years, some a few thousand maybe. So indeed, there's more variance, but it's still very good. You look at companies, tens of years. Well, lots of fluctuation because they haven't optimized. The system doesn't optimize very well. But nevertheless, it does show good evidence. But the thing that comes out of it that is so interesting is that the scaling is much more like organisms, that you've already mentioned this, than it is like cities, namely that it's sublinear rather than superlinear. And when it was sublinear, as in organisms, what did that tell us? That said that as they grow, they stop growing, they stabilize. It's called sigmoidal growth, technically, because it looks like a Greek sigma. They stop growing and then they die. I mean, that's the kind of life history of an organism, roughly, and that's what the theory explains. Whereas cities, you have this superlinear behavior that leads to open-ended growth, and it's not clear about mortality. I mean, cities don't die, roughly speaking. I know people will yell and scream, of course, cities that die. Well, yes, there are ancient cities and there are ghost towns sprinkled around, but the vast majority of cities that have ever existed, the serious cities, still exist. You could drop atom bombs on cities, and 25 years later, they're fine. You have a small fluctuation of the externalities in the stock market, and you lose TWA. You lose Lehman Brothers. And we're effectively losing Sears and so on. Doesn't take much. Cities are fragile. Are robust. Companies are fragile, and so the growth curve of a company mimics much more the growth curve that you and I have. You grow quickly, and then you stabilize. Whereas cities keep growing, basically.
And speaking of the fragility of companies, one of the astounding facts in this section of the book for me was that apparently the risk of a company dying does not depend at all on its age or its size.
Yes, that is if the what's called the mortality, which is the relative rate of death, doesn't change with the size. It's the same. What is remarkable, what we discovered, which we were surprised at actually, was that if you looked at mortality of companies, it looks like, in other words, if you take a cohort of companies at some particular time, and you ask, how many of these are still around 10 years, 20, 30 years later, it obeys the same law as taking a bunch of radioactive atoms and asking how many of those are left, and they decay randomly, and it just is an exponential decay. And that's what companies do, which is remarkable. And we don't fully understand it. I mean, what's going on here? It's again, one of these things that, when you think of companies, they seem so individual and so dependent upon a particular niche and a particular, and they make a big deal about, the CEO being so brilliant and so forth and all the rest. And yet, somehow, when you average over all of them, it's just like a bunch of atoms decaying. It's not. Now, of course, like everything else, and I haven't emphasized this enough throughout this, there are always outliers and there are always variances. So just as I said, when I said there be, animals or cities obey those scaling laws, I tried to say at the 80-90% level, the individuality of the organism, the individuality of the city, and in this case of the company, is the rest of it, is that other 20%, 10-20%. The individuality meaning the history, geography, culture, and so on. So it is with companies. And companies have much more variance. So there's much more room for being individual, so to speak. But the work that we've done shows extraordinary regularities, really, considering, the system we're dealing with.
One of the things I got to thinking about as I was reflecting on your book, I considered the difference between organisms and cities, the differences that we discussed. And at first pass, you sort of say that, companies are more like organisms. They're finite, they're mortal, and they die. And then I started to think about some modern companies, especially the bigger tech companies, the Amazons, the Googles, the Apples. And, I'm here sitting in Seattle, and Amazon essentially has taken over entire blocks of downtown Seattle. They have campuses where you work and you live effectively. You can get your laundry and your haircut at work. And so are some of these companies becoming more city-like in their organization? And could that potentially allow them to unlock the potential for open-ended growth?
Well, this is a question that comes up a lot, actually. And when I do talk to people in that world, and indeed in the very world that you just talked about, namely Amazon. Well, let's see, I'm on slightly awkward ground here, but I'll say this, that there are some CEOs of companies, and Bezos being one of them, that understands this phenomenon we've just been talking about, and the finiteness of companies. The companies are fragile and have a finite lifetime. And I didn't say, by the way, the data tells us that so to speak, the average lifespan of a company in the United States that's publicly traded, that means it's already gone through the gestation period of posting on the New York Stock Exchange, for example, is only 10 years. That's all you can expect of a company. Now, some companies may live 100 or 200 years, of course. There's great variance, and some may go bust after 1 year. And so the question is, one of the things I've speculated about, and it is speculation because we don't have the data on the internal mechanisms of companies. So it comes from both reading case studies and talking to major CEOs of major companies and others in their administration, is I've speculated on why this happens, why it is that companies die. Because they, first of all, even though they may behave like organisms in that sense, in the sense we just described, that is, they stop growing and then die, the mechanism is different. It's not, blood flowing through arteries and wearing out the arteries, although there might be some analog to that. It's much more, I believe, to do with the change that inevitably happens to a company as it ages, and that is going from something that's small and can move fast, is dominated by ideas, is dominated by, ideas for its product range and space, and is very innovative, typically at the beginning. But then as it grows, inevitably, usually anyway, the product space narrows because it has to respond to the market. So some things that it thought were very sexy and innovative actually doesn't sell. Well, you can't go on producing it. Whereas things that you thought were somehow mundane, like Bezos and Amazon, something that was a side issue, doing this stuff on the web and so on, turned out to be the thing that's made him essentially the richest man in the world, which is extraordinary. So, you have to respond to that. But of course, what that does in the vast majority of cases, it locks you in. And so you get locked in to, a certain way of doing business, a certain product space, certain narrowness. And that gets coupled with the more and more encroachment of bureaucracy and administration that is inevitable, because you're getting a bigger company. You have to have you have all these both external laws that you have to pay. You have to pay your taxes. You have all these HR laws, all these safety laws. Then the company itself starts imposing its own laws to make sure those laws are obeyed, and so on. And the whole thing builds up so that we have this image of the company that it's basically the bureaucracy and administration, and the innovative, productive part becomes kind of secondary to that. I mean, that's sort of a cartoon version of what happens. And what that means is that it becomes somewhat ossified. And when the externalities change, the company cannot adjust. Or if the competition, something new happens, competition comes along, you can't move the battleship fast enough, and the company goes under. And that's the typical kind of life history of companies, successful companies that become very large and are unable to adapt. They're simply unable to adapt fast enough. And so now cities are quite different, even though they're also a socioeconomic organization, because they're really not top-down. Of course, they have to have administrations and bureaucracies, clearly. You have to have something to manage much of the infrastructure. But cities are quite the opposite. They're open-ended. Great cities allow new things all the time to be developing. New York is maybe the greatest city in the world, because when you go there, you feel you can accomplish anything. I mean, that's sort of the image, to leave the farm and go to New York because I can be free and explore. I can become a great dancer. I can invent this new thing, and so on.
Yeah, anyone can move there.
Sorry?
Anyone can move there.
Anyone can move there. And that's Silicon Valley took over that within, the modern paradigm that we have. And I often say this, and maybe I shouldn't, but, when you go to New York, one of the things that you see, and San Francisco is another innovative city, homeless people. Seattle, my God, homeless people, and it's awful and terrible, and crazy people walking on the streets, some old people talking to themselves and so on. And the thing that's amazing about that is that they provide a boundary for the rest of us. We are sort of free to move right up to that edge of being sort of crazy and different and not fitting in quite in the right way, and so on. It's symbolic and metaphorical, but you can't do that in a company. You don't have the analog to that in a company. Companies are extraordinarily intolerant of having people that are different, that don't quite fit, that are bucking the system, that aren't doing what they're told, and so on. And even Google, which presented itself as that image, the MIT graduate living in the basement who never washes and so on, that was kind of the image they projected, and they could do anything. That was never really true. It might have been sort of true at the beginning with Google, actually, but now it's sort of like many other companies. Except, go ahead.
The HR function of a company is very much designed, and it's one of its primary purposes, other than just keeping track of who's hired and how much they're being paid and those things, is really to create a culture, a set of rules that everyone follows.
Absolutely. And of course, cities have cultures, but it's so gray and so broad, relatively speaking. And so a great city, people are attracted. Innovative cities are ones that have allowed innovative people to come and create. And, and I think and it's very hard. And I think that is the role of mayors and administrations, are to facilitate that in a way that is constructive. Of course, it can become destructive, but many cities have been extraordinary at doing that, and companies have been terrible at doing that, and then they freak out when things get rough and they realize they haven't innovated, they haven't allowed things to develop, and so on. Now, one of the things that's developed in recent years, it was always there, but much more so, is that, especially in Silicon Valley, IT companies is buying up companies, of course, to bring in that innovation. And I think that's only been marginally successful. I don't think it's not organic. It has worked. I mean, what was it? Facebook brought Instagram, for example. It didn't invent it. And that's presumably been successful. But many of these other little companies that they bought up, and sometimes they buy them up, of course, in a traditional way of suppressing new ideas rather than innovating because they feel threatened. So it's a complicated process. But now I want to go to the very hub of your question, which is the Amazons and the Googles and so on that provide something that cities have provided in the past, and present too, of course. They provide a certain infrastructure. I mean, Google was the first to do this in providing, childcare and free meals, and sort of you can almost sleep there and live there. And they were having maybe some problems even with people sort of moving in, and so on. Amazon has now done it, as you say, in Seattle by building these housing for people and so on, which other companies have done, of course. Now, I don't think that's going to do it. I don't think it may have some of the trappings of a city, but I don't think so. I don't think it will have the essence of a city. And I say that because in the 19th century, I mean, that's what companies did, especially industrial companies, coal mining companies. After all, here, there are towns, of course, that are company. I mean, the company town, the company store. So they were, but they didn't survive in the end. And I think that's going to be true of these IT companies. And that is, they will not survive because of this. They will only survive if they can somehow, which is extraordinarily difficult, encourage and engender what a city can do, which is this much more open, transparent way of allowing sort of rogue people to move in. I mean, that's how Silicon Valley started, after all. I mean, the people that weren't going to go to IBM or whatever, who had crazy, might have been considered crazy ideas at the time.
Well, this does sound like, I immediately think of Google's Moonshot Lab. They've essentially taken a pile of, they essentially take a pile of money and say, you people go over there, don't break anything, but feel free to just tinker with whatever you think is interesting.
Yes, and I think that's been mixed. I mean, it has been, there's no question that's stimulated by this kind of idea that can you have either, a piece of you that is unfettered. Better still would be to spawn a company that in fact is completely independent of you somehow, which then kind of means that if they're independent of you. So the question is, how much independence do they need in order to really be self-sustained in their innovative qualities, without feeling beholden? Because there's a big psychological side to this, as being part of it. And I know that from people at Google. I mean, it's highly non-trivial. And so I don't know. I don't think there's a simple solution. And I had been thinking, by the way, that this was not possible. That is, you can't actually have a company operating in the free market system that we have, that it operates like a city, or even a piece of it, that it just is not going to work. I have backed off from that. I may be wrong on that, but I don't know. The jury's out. There aren't enough examples, and I'm not at all sure that companies, even if they do things like the Google moonshot, really are able to let go. They're very much like parents and children, and they always wanted them to be visiting them on the weekend and coming for Sunday dinner or giving them presents and so on. I think it's not so easy.
Interesting. So
that's purely speculative. I mean, I don't know.
One of the last questions I want to ask has to do with cities, innovation, and COVID. So there's been a lot of, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of immigration and emigration from some cities. Yes. I haven't seen that much data on this, but it seems to be happening at some reasonable level. People are moving out of certain cities that we traditionally think of as innovation hubs and moving into new cities that we don't traditionally think of as innovation hubs. Do you think that that's happening very much? And what do you think the nature of, how does a New York become a New York and attract the innovative people? Do you see anything interesting happening with respect to the COVID pandemic and its aftermath?
Well, of course, we're way too early, needless to say, to know what the long-term effects of this are going to be. Certainly, the sparse data that I have seen is actually not that impressive in terms of the hype that's been made out of it. Namely, yes, I mean, I'm in Santa Fe, and there's been a big influx of people from California, Texas even, and so forth, New York. But what does a large flux mean? It's hundreds of people, actually, because we're a small town. Mm-hmm. And the number of people really leaving San Francisco and New York is actually not that big. I think we have to wait to see this other big effect that we don't know is, going back to offices, mm-hmm. and 9 to 5 or whatever, 8 to 5 or whatever. We don't know quite yet how, will the system just slowly relax back to what it was effectively, with some, bells and whistles to do with being on Zoom occasionally, or will it in fact become this kind of hybrid model of going into the office a few days a week, or not at all in some instances, and doing it all electronically? A lot of things work very well with Zoom. I, of course, hate Zoom because I'm old. But, I mean, two-dimensional and so formalized and so structured and so on. Now, new applications will develop. It will improve enormously, I'm sure. But in the kind of work that I do, certain things work fine on Zoom. If you have a collaboration going and something going, you can keep it going and do good things. But to do something truly creative and to start new things, mm-hmm. it's very hard. And nothing can replace being in 3 dimensions in the same room, so to speak, with a blackboard and bullshitting non-linearly, brainstorming and so on. And you need some of that. And companies, yes, the 90-something% of a company doesn't need that. But a few percent does. And that's how a company dies, when that few percent goes to almost zero, and then it dies eventually because it's not creating anything, doesn't realize what's going on. So I think many companies will realize this, I think. And I think many people will feel more comfortable actually going back to a traditional situation. But my intuition is that there will be a change, and there will be these kind of hybrid things, but it may not have as big an effect as we feel at the moment. And therefore, how much it will affect people leaving the city, and therefore the evolution of the city, I'm not sure. My intuition is it won't affect the city much in the long run, because it's not, cities are there for work, yes, but they're for, as I said, for interaction, for bringing people together, the buzz of, New York is there, yes, because of what we said earlier. There's enormous opportunities there and the feeling that you can do all these various things. But it's also there for the sexy buzz of the city, that, all the interesting things that are going on. And it all builds on each other. And, I think that's hard to replicate in many places. So I think people have a need for that, especially young people.
Well, Geoffrey, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you for joining me here. Are there any final thoughts that you want to leave people with in terms of your book? And is there any place that people can go to follow your work?
Well, I do write things. I write essays occasionally. I struggle with writing, so I don't write much. But I would say, one of the reasons I wrote that book for several reasons. One was because I was becoming increasingly concerned, and this is, by the way, prior to Mr. Trump, the lack of respect and understanding and the role of science in society and how crucial that is. And that we are losing that input in a dramatic way. And this was before Trump. And Trump just put a huge exclamation mark after that, because he introduced something that I thought could never happen. That was that actually, facts and science and truth, in a certain sense, don't matter. You can sort of bend them whatever way kind of suits you. That was the image anyway that's been projected, and we've had some terrible results from it, like several 100,000 people dying unnecessarily, and so it has huge implications. So I wrote the book because I wanted to write a book of science and about science and a way of thinking, and this was important, a way of thinking that we don't integrate into society. It's not part of our political process. There are, I don't know how many members of Congress there are, but I think there's only one, maybe two, that have any inkling of what science is about. Yet the whole of society runs because of science and technology, and all the things they're legislating on, all the decisions they're making, actually, in many, many cases, have their initiation in science and technology, and they don't understand it. And I find that distressing, and I find that a problem of some urgency, because all kinds of bad decisions get made. And of course, part of that was originally driven by the fact that people don't understand that we're about the whole question of climate change, but much more importantly, the whole question of sustainability. And fundamentally, I began to realize, and I wrote about this in the book, that most people, even in Congress, don't understand what an exponential is, even though they use that word colloquially all the time. That the extraordinary implications of exponential are just simply not appreciated. So I wrote it for that, and I wrote it also because I wanted people to see something which I hope comes across a little bit in the book, the extraordinary interconnectedness of everything, and the extraordinary spiritual beauty that you can get from understanding that. And that's what I get from it, is that I stand in awe of that in terms of the world around us. And that underneath the extraordinary diversity and messiness that is around us underlies an extraordinary regularity and simplicity. And one should, I want people to appreciate that, because it's beautiful. And it wants me to go on living. I'm 80 years old, but I want to live because I enjoy that.
Well, Geoffrey, thank you for your time. I think that's the perfect place to end. And I look forward to talking to you again at some point.
Yes, Nick, thank you so much for having me, and I enjoyed it. Thank you. Your questions were terrific, by the way.
Thank you.
No, they were really good, because you'd obviously given great thought to, whatever the bits and pieces I wrote. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.